So, Hiten, thank you so much for joining. Where are you coming in from?
I'm in Los Angeles. I'm back in sunny LA.
So, maybe can you start by just telling kind of everyone your career arc, like how you came to cover the real estate industry as a journalist?
Sure, yeah. So I grew up in a place which didn't really have a press, right? I grew up in a monarchy. I grew up in Dubai. The UAE is a monarchy. There is a press, but it's really just it's a propaganda vehicle, really. So I didn't really have sort of a thriving free press around, but I was keenly aware that that is something that I was interested in. And then I went to college for business and cognitive science at Toronto, and I kind of was dabbling in social psychology research while I was there. So this is a very sort of sideways path into journalism. I worked in advertising briefly in Toronto. I loved the sort of the creative aspect of advertising. I did not enjoy the final sort of the end game of advertising, which is you're not really doing too much of consequence in the end, right? I didn't find that very compelling. And then my move into journalism was serendipitous completely. I came to New York for Thanksgiving. So I went to Columbia just to see if I could, meet some professors and stuff. The day that I went, I was thinking about either doing an MBA or journalism school. The day that I went to Columbia, the business school was closed for some event and the journalism school was open, and the director of admissions was sitting in his office by himself. So I just kind of walked in and had a chat, and that's how it happened. So I got in, I had 10 days to finish the application, which I did. I got in, had an incredible year, and learned it from zero.
Yeah, finishing a journalism application under a deadline is kind of a poetic reality,
Exactly,
that,
right.
right? Like,
And then I got to the real deal maybe a year after graduating, and I've been here ever since. And yeah, I think what's happened, what I got very lucky with, and there's a lot of series of good fortune in my career, but real estate, pound for pound, for me, and probably for you because you're in the business, but is the most exciting, the most consequential industry that one could hope to cover, right? In a consistent daily and sort of overall lifespan view, there is nothing more interesting than real estate, right? It's the largest industry in the US. It is the path for wealth creation for 9 out of 10 Americans. There's so many layers to it, right? You can cover crime, celebrity, capital markets, drama, development. It's pretty mind-boggling. Whatever you want to cover, you can cover it through the lens of real estate. So that's where I'm at.
it's interesting to think about real estate as just such a diverse industry to cover, right? Because I've seen obviously with the Real Deal covers and what you in particular cover, but you're touching on everything. And I guess one of the questions I have is from the vantage point you're in. Real estate, I imagine, and the Real Deal probably historically covered real estate and real estate capital markets and real estate operations and real estate services. But increasingly, you've probably felt this encroaching presence of technology as kind of a thematic trend and Proptech. And I'm curious from your position, like, what did it feel like to first have that creep into, traditional real estate journalism?
I would say about 2013, and that's shortly after I started at The Real Deal, just a few months after, is when we started hearing about tech coming in. It wasn't prop tech, that word I don't believe existed at the time, but that's when it started really creeping in. So 2013, you had a bunch of promising startups, and really the playbook was like, hey, this is working in another industry. We know the pain points of this industry. Why don't we just apply it? There wasn't too much in terms of original innovation being done. It was more context switching, if that makes sense. Then there was a period, I want to say right about when Fifth Wall started, or maybe just before that, when there were a lot of imitators in the field, right? So suddenly you saw this explosion of startups, a lot of them bullshit, right? Coming in, trying to do crowdfunding, trying to do debt underwriting, trying to do a lot of stuff. Most of those startups aren't around anymore. And then fast forward to today, 2020, I think we saw 7 billion plus in debt and equity deals in Proptech. We saw 50 odd deals where the check size was over $20 million, which is significant. And I think it's only growing from there. So
I imagine the bulk of your readership is real estate based, right? They are tuning into the Real Deal, but I imagine that you're also serving your customers, your readers. And do you find that there's a greater demand to just like know what's happening in the industry? Because so much about, for example, Fifth Wall positions itself is like we're saying, hey, we're a conduit between the innovation economy, what's happening in the ecosystem of venture and startups and all of that, and we're connecting you, real estate company, to that. We're translating that. Do you find that you kind of have that role as translator a bit and kind of translating what this tech means into real estate digestible language?
That is a very good question. I can think back to the initial article we did, which was like real estate's hot new entrepreneurs. And the language, the actual verbs and sentences that we had to use in that, I would be embarrassed to read that now. But
Right.
yes, to your point, it served a valuable, translation interpretation message. Hey, this is what this company is doing. Now we can use words like big data or data science or stackable interactive plans and stuff at that time because there was no mechanism for our readers to understand those things. So it would be like, think of X and then think of real estate. It was very, very infantile in a way, right? The language we had to use. Now there's a level of literacy when it comes to tech and real estate that I think even our older readers, even a lot of our older readers who tend to be brokers, developers, investors, even hedge fund managers, they kind of get it now. So the baseline of starting the conversation is a lot higher now.
Since your first conversation with VTS to today, right, when there's the open doors, the hippos, the state titles, the compasses of the world that have now created tens of billions of dollars of enterprise value. Sometime in that intervening 4 years, this light bulb moment happened for the real estate industry, where I describe it as like an age of enlightenment, where this industry that had sat out 2 decades worth of technological innovation kind of woke up and was like, oh, we need to start basically catching up. And there was this kind of slingshot effect. What precipitated that?
Well, I think there are probably 2 elements to that, right? One is cultural, but maybe the first is the use cases, right? When technology is actually playing a part in boosting your NOI, when technology is actually playing a part in making your tenants happier, and you're seeing that in terms of when you go to lease renewals, when you are maybe marketing a property, when you can see that in action. So that's one, right? You've got to see it to believe it in a way. The other aspect of that would be cultural, right? You probably saw, when you were thinking of like, who is my sort of North Star in the real estate industry? You might think of a Jonathan Gray, right? From Blackstone. You might think of someone of that category. I would call those the suits, right? That's the people who are like fully versed in the capital markets, understand that real estate in many sort of ways is just structured finance. A prior generation looked up to, let's call them the cowboys, the Harry Maclows, the Harry Helmsleys, the Buccaneers who looked at the skyline like a game of dice, right? So there was a shift that happened between the cowboys and the suits, right? And you're part of that. The next shift, which is happening now, which is why it's such an interesting time, is probably from the suits to the technologists. People are looking at investors, tech creators, startups, founders. This sort of lexicon didn't even exist in real estate before. So with that shift comes maybe more openness to investing in technology, implementing technology. So I think it's twofold.
So as you're seeing this transition happen, do you think that the next great leaders, the kind of the figureheads of the real estate industry, do you think that they are today perhaps characterized as technology companies? And one of the reasons I asked the question is that a lot of the real estate companies today that are some of the most iconic real estate companies and the largest real estate companies that trade at the highest premiums to NAV are companies like in cold storage and companies that are in logistics and companies that are in data centers, which historically were almost thought of as operating companies, or in the case of data centers, technology companies. So there's been this kind of transition from the historic tried and true sectors, the office, retail sectors, to these new kind of technology-like, operationally intensive, higher leverage businesses that really seem to be commanding a lot of the attention in the real estate industry. Do you think the same thing is afoot with respect to technology?
Yes, but I think that the power of incumbency in real estate is so strong. There's a lot of forgiveness built in, but there's also so many opportunities to get it right. But that figure is no longer a real estate person. They're part technologist, part operator, part capital allocator, right? So I think there's going to be like a triumvirate person. The people who are going to define the future of the industry are smart incumbents who understand this and say, you know what, my NOIs are $300 million. I am printing money right now. I could take 10% of that and invest it in this. I could change, I have 6 million square feet of office. Let me take 500,000 square feet of that and try something completely bananas, right? And then scale it out. So In this case, I don't think it's going to be a whole new guard. I think it's going to be sort of a metamorphosis of the current guard, if you will.
I think a lot of real estate companies are looking to reposition themselves more as platforms and saying the power of our incumbency is not just the fact that we have this huge footprint. It's that that footprint allows us to be creative, to disrupt ourselves, to embrace technology, to do things that are not possible for the owner of an individual asset.
Yep.
And so there's this weird kind of almost mental model shift that's happening where I think real estate owners want to see themselves more or should see themselves more as operating companies and as platforms than they used to kind of think of themselves.
You know, what's an element that hasn't really come up in your conversations yet that I've been thinking about more too is who are the most politically influential people in a given city? Typically, developers, right? Real estate operators are typically the most politically influential. They've got capital, political capital that they've sort of developed through donations, through creating jobs, through making projects in a city, and their work is apparent, right? So I think there is a political capital element that is so powerful, that is unspoken, but is there to add to all of the other advantages.
Interesting. What we think of as like a tech mogul and a real estate mogul are today two totally different things, but they might actually converge around local political capital and influence.
I agree with that.
Real estate assets definitionally occupy physical space, and almost definitionally, they occupy that physical space at the edge of a consumer network, right? Where consumers live or where they work or where they make things, right? But I think there's also like more dimensions to it, which is could a real estate asset, a building itself, become a power plant, right? And actually be generating power vis-a-vis renewable energy or by pulling power off the grid and storing it in on-site batteries. So like the conceptualization of a building, right? And that power of incumbency, which today is kind of conditioned almost as like location, location, location. It's like location still matters, but now there's all these third-party, technologically driven monetization opportunities around energy and data and aerial access that are also going to be real estate-like in their kind of the power of incumbency there. That if you value a real estate asset as just a real estate asset, you're probably undervaluing it over the long term because that position of incumbency of occupying only that piece of dirt could have so many other monetization vectors based on how the world progresses technologically. And I think that's a real mindset shift, right? It's almost like we're now, you made this comment about we went from cowboys to suits to technologists, but it might be that it starts over again and the cowboys come back and they're the ones kind of accumulating a lot of these new monetization angles for real estate.
Conversely, though, the importance of your incumbent assets, some people have taken that too far, right? And I'm thinking specifically about people who own stuff in like Grand Central, right? For a long time, they have been under this, and it's been true for the longest time, credit to them, that we're in Maine and Maine. This asset cannot be replicated anywhere else. I don't think that's true anymore. I think that those sort of assets that have banked purely on their physical location, and there are many of them, are in trouble. They're in big trouble. And I might get in trouble for saying this now, but that's what I believe. It's just, you cannot bet purely on being in the middle of having a normal Class A building in the middle of a great location and say, yeah, that's my meal ticket forever.
Yeah, I think that it's kind of like we're saying two different things. One is that real estate itself is so advantageous in its ability to potentially monetize new technological themes and trends and business opportunities that arise. But on the other hand, the kind of axiom that is defined the real estate industry historically, which is that like location is ultimately what matters. It's not that location doesn't matter. It's kind of that location is a bit more amorphous. And so you have a more diffuse value to location that's more conditioned around logistics and different kinds of goods need to get to consumers with a different kind of immediacy. And that's again a different mental model for the real estate industry.
If you think of, Bonobos is a great example of that, right? They'll still have their store in Flatiron or wherever, and you go in, but you're only going in to get a vibe and to try it, and then the rest of the transaction might happen completely outside of that physical location. So you can never bet against New York. I think that part is true, but you can certainly bet against people who think that it's all back to normal. I think you can bet against that.
Let's switch gears a little bit. You painted an interesting example, actually before we started talking about how the mindset generationally is different, within real estate companies and within real estate families. Can you unpack that a little bit and how that explains some of your healthy skepticism about the real estate industry's ability to truly go carbon neutral?
Yeah. So my theory, and this is not scientific, this is sort of just based on observation, what I've seen, is that, as you've said many times very eloquently, tackling climate change is a collective action problem. A collective action problem, by definition, means you're thinking beyond yourself. A lot of the developers, a lot of the sort of leaders of real estate companies, a lot of them are, products of public schools, the Bronx, Brooklyn, Queens, your equivalents in California, Florida, wherever. They came from a world in which they still tapped into the collective. There is some sort of sense of that. You take it down a couple of layers, their kids or maybe their kids' kids, that realization doesn't seem to be there anymore. And the reason is they're all siloed, right? Who cares if the public school is crappy next to you? I never went to it. Who cares if the transportation isn't working? I Uber everywhere, right? Or I fly everywhere or whatever. So there is almost a removal of them from the public fabric that I think affects the way they think about these things. So when you talk about a collective action problem, you familiar with the decline of New York in the 70s and all of that? What did the real estate industry do then? Lou Rudin, Bert Resnick, and a bunch of the other sort of industry leaders said, this city's in trouble and we can do something about it. They prepaid their property taxes just to kind of tide the city over. Guess what? New York City was in a major fiscal crisis this time around. You don't hear anything about prepaying property taxes. In fact, all you hear is sort of complaints about PPP loans and this and that. So just look at the contrast. New York City was on the brink then, New York City is on the brink now. But the difference in the way the industry reacted, I believe, is partly a function of where these people came from, what kind of lives they lived.
What are some of the most inspiring stories you see from your position around the real estate industry kind of relearning, I guess, what it kind of lost in the last couple decades?
I think the social imperative almost, like, you could almost take that aside for a little bit. If the financial incentive to do it is strong enough, if the regulatory sort of stick to not do it is strong enough, if you combine those two things and the tenant demand is there, then I think you could see some stuff happening. So obviously people who are investing in technologies that make things better is good. I think that's a good thing. I think the encouraging thing is that real estate people have a radar like no other industry. They know when it makes sense to change their tune. And when it does happen, they do it with extreme speed. They do it sort of wholeheartedly, and they put a lot of money behind it, right? We've seen that with Proptech, for example. It's not a social imperative as much, but the same kind of thing happened.
Yeah, it's interesting you drew the parallel to Proptech, right? Because Proptech wasn't a thing back in 2016, and then sometime in the intervening 5 years, it became a thing. Now, lots of money has gone into it. Again, this might be the optimist in me, but I think that history is going to repeat itself with sustainability and this imperative to decarbonize. I think we're even earlier, though. Meaning, I think we are back in like the equivalent in PropTech of like 2012, right? Mm-hmm. But I actually think it'll happen faster because unlike PropTech, you have these outside forces that are also pointing at the real estate industry, the regulators, capital markets, their tenants, the media, that are really pushing the real estate industry to do something in a way that PropTech, no one was pushing, no one was critical of the real estate industry.
Have you ever seen the show? It's my new favorite show, so I've been raving about it. Have you ever seen Drive to Survive, the Netflix show? Okay, so it's about Formula One. And what I find remarkable about this show is that it's done in conjunction with Formula One. So they're part of the show very much. They film the same race from the perspective of all the drivers. And so you might see an episode in which you're focusing on Lewis Hamilton, for example, and you're rooting for Lewis Hamilton when you're with him. You're like cheering against everyone else and you're like, yeah, let's go, Lewis. The next episode will have the same race and you're in someone else's car and you're in someone else's team and you're embedded in their psyche. You start rooting for the other guy very quickly because they've captured everything. So I think the challenge and the opportunity here for you guys or anyone else in that space is like, if you can make them change their sort of the side they're rooting for in a way that's immersive and interesting, I think it's so powerful. I think there's so much that could be done.
And it's a war of ideas. I think of the media also is increasingly having a focus on this.
Yeah, I will say on the media front, though, there's one of the disadvantages we have when it comes to specialty media. So with that sort of rah-rah attitude that a lot of publications have, comes a lack of skepticism, comes a lack of like really diving into what this means. I saw an ad campaign from something called Well, which is a building standard, right? A bunch of other celebrities talking about, hey, for a safe return to the office or safe return to the spaces we love, think about the Well standard. The Well standard has nothing to do with infectious diseases. The Well standard has nothing to do with air pathogens or anything. There's a lot of that. And you know what? Some publication might pick that up and go with it. So when you're in a specialty media space, there is and a savvy operator can use that to their advantage, which is like they can plant any kind of nonsense in the press. The disadvantage for the whole industry, though, is there's not as much inquiry. There's not as much understanding of what is real, what could actually move the needle, and what is just window dressing.
It's a really interesting point, and maybe it's one to kind of end on, is like the notion that the real estate industry has paid lip service to a lot of these trends, right? Technology and sustainability is the two we've talked about. And it's very hard for the average consumer, the average tenant, to disambiguate what's real and what's not. And by that same token, a real estate owner who wins some kind of self-congratulatory award and or builds a garden on a roof is not really doing anything for the environment, even though it might be optically interesting and or newsworthy. So I think what's just important is to continue the conversation around like what is real, what should the real estate industry be doing, and how do we call attention to those real estate companies that are doing the right thing technologically, environmentally, and celebrating that, and really separating that from those that aren't. So I always love reading The Real Deal for exactly that reason and kind of our conversations.
I appreciate that, Brendan. It's a lot of fun chatting with you.